Forget Robinson Crusoe on Mars. Now, we've got Lord of the Flies on Mars. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2021 science fiction film, Voyagers. I got a chance to see this one a little early, so I want to thank Lionsgate and Cinemania World for the screener. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Voyagers stars Sheridan, Lily Rose Depp, and Colin Farrell, and was directed by Neil Burger. It tells the story of a crew of teenagers sent into deep space on a multi-generational mission in search of a new planet that can support human life. As with most of my screener watches, I went into this movie completely blind. I saw the poster right before watching, but knew nothing else about it. And that's how I usually recommend going into most movies, but this is one where I think knowing the basic premise would be helpful in deciding if this is a movie you want to invest your time in. I've also got to say that the promotional material for this movie is incredibly misleading. We've got that sort of risque poster, and then the trailer, which I watched right before writing this review, and I've gotta say, it's been a while since I've seen a more misleading trailer. I mean, I guess it kind of puts forward some of the main ideas and themes of the movie, but that's about it. I can tell you that if you're going into this movie looking for the energy and style that you saw in that trailer, you're gonna be extremely disappointed. That being said, I do think this movie has a really interesting premise. It starts off much more science-forward than you typically see in these types of young adult sci-fi films. In fact, it's set up for what could have been a very interesting experimental movie. Not experimental as in abstract, but rather as in a scientific experiment. Because even though the general idea of humans needing to find a new planet to live on has been done many times before, the exact way in which the humans in this film are attempting to make this happen is really unique. The idea of a multi-generational journey, the idea of training these kids in the specific way that they're trained, there was actually a lot of potential there, and as the movie got going, I really thought I was gonna like this one a lot. But after the first act or so, things really start to shift with this film. The science focus all but disappears. And while that was kind of disappointing, in the moment, I was still pretty invested in the story. Because now, rather than the experiment, we have this focus on a mystery of sorts. It starts to approach things from a very classic sci-fi space thriller angle, but also has some more psychological aspects sprinkled in that keep it all kind of unique, and at least keeps you interested enough to want to know what's actually happening. So I was pretty on board, at least with the story and concepts, through the first half or so. But then we have another story transition. It's no longer a scientific experiment movie, it's barely a sci-fi movie, it's essentially Lord of the Flies. And while there is some degree of intrigue to having that type of story set in space, it's done in a remarkably unoriginal way. I mean, you'd think there'd actually be a decent amount of potential there, but other than occasionally using some sort of spaceship-y technology to do something, this film doesn't add anything new to that Lord of the Flies concept. And if this was actually a Lord of the Flies remake, then fine. But this movie tries to be its own thing, and then falls back into this bland retelling without utilizing any of the genuinely interesting stuff that it set up in the first half. None of the performances here are anything to write home about, which certainly didn't help the film, but I think the biggest issue here is definitely the writing. Like I said before, the premise and some of the stuff in the beginning is fine, but even then, before things take the turn into Lord of the Flies, there are hints of issues. The dialogue throughout is pretty bad. Now, with a film about teenagers, that's not entirely uncommon, since teen dialogue and interactions written by adults often sounds really unnatural. But surprisingly, that aspect of the dialogue wasn't even my biggest issue. The thing that stuck out like a sore thumb to me was how ridiculously on the nose and obvious the dialogue was when trying to put forward the film's themes. So you've got this combination of very mediocre line deliveries and this eye-rolling dialogue that produces these incredibly stilted moments. Voyagers is a great example of a movie that thinks it has something much more unique and profound to say than it actually does. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is definitely the premise. Honestly, this movie started off pretty well. Even though we've seen this type of looking for a new home planet story before, I thought the setup for this one was super interesting. The idea of training these people from birth to go on this multi-generational journey was something bigger than I would have expected from a movie like this. It had a lot of potential, both as a scientific experiment-centric film, but also as a character study and a tale of exploring the morality of its setup. It's just unfortunate that it ends up taking a much more generic route. On the con side, the biggest issue is the writing. Talking about the writing of a movie can refer to a lot of different things, and honestly, there are issues with just about every aspect of writing here. The story itself, especially in the second half, the character decisions and motivations, the dialogue, the incorporation of the themes. Not only does it play out in a disappointingly bland and predictable manner, but it comes across so stilted and forced. Part of that's obviously on the shoulders of the actors with their line delivery, but not all of it. This movie clearly had lofty goals with its messaging. And of course, not every movie's gonna be profound and enlightening, but this one just tries way too hard. That's an issue you can look past if there's something else to the movie that keeps things interesting or exciting, but that's just not the case here. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Voyagers or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links to all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Voyagers 2.5 out of 5 paws. I was on the edge between 2.5 and 3. I thought it had a really interesting premise and some admittedly fine moments, but the heavy-handedness of its uninspired themes and some really disappointing writing dragged this spaceship down. I would recommend Voyagers to people who like YA science fiction. It's definitely a much more teen-oriented movie than the first 15 or 20 minutes would have you think. I also think that people who've never read or watched Lord of the Flies might get a little bit more enjoyment out of this one, simply because you're discovering and experiencing these classic themes for the first time. But if you're already familiar with that story, then I don't think this one has all that much to offer you besides some okay teen sci-fi stuff. If you liked Voyagers, I would most obviously recommend Lord of the Flies. The similarities are undeniable here, so if you want another allegorical tale about society, rules, and chaos, then you've gotta watch that first film adaptation, or just read the book. If you want another sci-fi film about long-distance interplanetary travel, then you should check out Passengers. This is another movie with big ideas, a really interesting premise, and some moral ambiguity to its story that doesn't quite live up to what it could have been. And if you just like the style here and want a Neil Burger film that's actually quite good, then you should check out Limitless. It's a very slick and stylish high-concept sci-fi movie with a really cool premise that I think actually delivers. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Voyagers? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that features a spacewalk? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.